I'm here discussing sodium reduction and its relationship to lowering blood pressure and cardiovascular disease. We know for a long time there are societies around the world, we've studied some of them, that are very low in sodium intake. One of their characteristics is that they have low blood pressures. They don't get high blood pressure. Another characteristic is when they migrate, even locally, they start changing their behaviors. Their blood pressures goes up, and one of the things that's very closely related to is sodium intake. That's the low sodium group, and they can get away with very low sodiums because the kidney is marvelous at conserving sodium. We, on the other hand, are in a very high sodium environment. We take in over 3.5 grams of sodium on average every day in this country. 3/4 of the population take in over 4 grams a day. So it's enormously high, way above any recommendation that's ever been made. Very little of it is coming from natural sources, only about 10% from food sources that are natural. About 10% adding sodium at the table or during the preparation of food. The vast majority, about 80%, coming during food processing. And so we have to ask ourselves, does that make sense? Is that rational on any basis? And I think we then look at blood pressure, and we have the best type of study design there, clinical trials. We have lots of them, and they have repeatedly shown that when you lower sodium intake, blood pressure goes down. And it's true in hypertensives, true in normotensives. It happens more in some groups that are a little more sensitive, African Americans, older people, people with higher pressures, but it happens across the board. And we have very convincing evidence from meta-analysis, and we know about how much we could expect. We know that blood pressure is a very important risk factor. In fact, it's probably the most important risk factor that's out there. It probably accounts for about 10 million deaths a year and about 7% of disability-adjusted life years. If you move to asking about blood pressure and lowering cardiovascular events directly, very hard to study that. We have limited data. There are mostly observational studies. They're very poor quality. Some of them are cross-sectional, no temporal sequence, very poor quality in the measurements, and prone to a lot of error, random and systematic. Some of them done in sick cohorts. They just happened to be there and they did the study. But it's likely that illness led to counseling or just not being able to eat the calories and the sodium. So you have to be really careful in interpreting those studies. American Heart asked a group, including myself, to look at the quality of those observational studies, and basically it was horrible. But we got into the specifics, but I'll just say basically it was very limited. We can look at the clinical trials that were designed for blood pressure reduction, and with the behavioral ones, especially in prevention of hypertension, we can do long-term follow-up, and we've done that. And the premise here is that if you teach somebody to change their behavior for the trial, they're going to continue with that knowledge over time. May not do it as well as they did it when they were in the trial, but it's likely they're going to continue. So you would expect what we call a legacy effect. And when we followed trials of hypertension prevention cohorts from first trial and the second trial over now about 20 years of follow-up, what we see is a pattern that's very striking, that the group that was originally counseled in sodium reduction have much less in the way of cardiovascular events and cardiovascular mortality than the group that got usual care. And it's very striking. It's about a 30% reduction in cardiovascular events, about a 20% reduction in mortality. We have one trial that's been done in Taiwan that showed dramatic reductions in cardiovascular mortality, hospitalizations, healthcare costs, but it has flaws in the analysis. It's a cluster design. They didn't analyze it that way. There's a very big trial going on in North China right now. I'm on the Data and Safety Monitoring Board. And it's a cluster design, which I think is the only practical way to address this. It's randomized about 600 villages, about 21,000 people. And that might be helpful, but we won't have results for about 2 to 3 years.